Seattle never felt entirely awake. Even at noon, the sky hovered in a state of hesitation, gray, undecided, like a thought left unfinished. The kind of sky that made people speak softer, move slower, as if the city itself were listening. Ethan Caldwell stood by the kitchen counter, watching steam curl upward from a chipped porcelain cup. It had been cracked for years, not shattered, just a thin fracture running along its side like a vein. The kind you didn't notice unless you held it to the light. Lillian used to say it gave the cup character. Ethan used to think it meant something else. That some things didn't break all at once. Are you listening? Her voice came from behind him, sharper than the morning air. Ethan turned slightly, not fully. I am. Lillian leaned against the doorway, arms folded. She was dressed already, black coat, heels, hair tied with a precision that felt intentional, like armor. She looked like someone heading somewhere important. She always did, lately. You said that yesterday, she replied. And the day before. Ethan nodded slowly, eyes dropping back to the cup. I heard you. That's not the same thing. Silence settled between them, not heavy, not explosive. Just present. Like furniture that had always been there. In the early years, silence between them used to feel full, comfortable, shared. Now it felt like a gap neither of them knew how to cross. Lillian exhaled, pushing herself off the wall. Victor invited me to another event tonight. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Not enough to break it, just enough to feel the edge. Another one. It's not another one, Ethan. It's... She stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't sound like an accusation. It's opportunity. For what? For something more than this. Her hand gestured vaguely around the apartment, not dismissive, but not affectionate either. The space was small, cluttered with sketches, unpaid bills tucked under books, a life mid-construction. Ethan followed her gaze, then looked back at the cup. We said this was temporary. You said that, Lillian corrected gently. I believed you. There was no anger in her voice. That was what unsettled him. Anger, at least, required energy. This felt like something quieter, something already decided. Ethan set the cup down carefully. I'm working on a new project. If it goes through, it's always if. Her interruption was soft, almost apologetic, but it landed harder than anything louder could have. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words he wanted to say about patience, about timing, about belief felt rehearsed even to himself. Lillian stepped closer, her heels clicking faintly against the floor. I can't keep waiting for a version of our life that only exists in your head. And I can't become someone I'm not just to catch up to where you think we should be. Their eyes met, then. Not with hostility, not even with sadness, just recognition. Like two people realizing they had been walking in different directions for longer than they'd admitted. Lillian looked away first. I'm going tonight, she said. You don't have to come. Ethan nodded once. I know. She hesitated just for a second. As if something inside her flickered. A memory, maybe. Or doubt. Then it passed. Don't wait up. The door closed softly behind her. Ethan stood there for a long time after she left, the apartment suddenly too still. He reached for the cup again, lifting it toward the window. The gray light caught the crack just right, making it visible from edge to edge. He ran his thumb along it. It hadn't always been there. They bought it together, years ago, from a street market. It was cheap, imperfect, slightly uneven. Lillian had laughed when she picked it up. It looks like it survived something. Ethan had smiled. So will we. Back then, it felt like a promise. Now it felt like a misunderstanding. He set the cup back down. This time, it tipped slightly, just enough for a thin line of coffee to spill over the edge, tracing the crack before dripping onto the counter. Ethan didn't move to stop it. He just watched. As if the cup were finally doing what it had been trying to do all along. That night, he didn't turn on the lights. The city outside blurred into streaks of distant motion, headlights sliding across wet pavement. Somewhere far below, people laughed sharp, bright, temporary. Ethan sat in the dark, the untouched second cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He didn't call her. Not because he didn't want to, but because something inside him already understood that whatever would happen next had already begun. Victor Hargrove did not enter Lillian's life like a storm. There was no sudden disruption, no dramatic shift in gravity. He arrived the way expensive things often did, quietly, deliberately, with the assumption that he already belonged. It started with an invitation Ethan never attended. A charity gala downtown, hosted in a glass-walled building that overlooked Elliott Bay. Lillian had stood in front of the mirror that evening, adjusting an earring that caught the light just enough to make her hesitate. "You could still come," she said, not turning around. Ethan sat at the dining table behind her, hunched over a spread of blueprints. The lamp cast a warm circle around him, isolating him from the rest of the room. "I have a deadline," he replied, without looking up. "You always do." It wasn't said with resentment. Not exactly. More like observation. Ethan exhaled softly. "It matters, Lil." There was a pause long enough for something to be reconsidered. Then she nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Okay." That was the first absence. Not loud, not memorable, just recorded somewhere neither of them would revisit until it was too late. Victor remembered her name the first time they met. That was what Lillian told herself mattered. Not the way his hand lingered slightly longer than necessary when they shook. Not the tailored suit that fit like certainty. Not the effortless way people shifted around him, as if he carried an invisible center of gravity. No, it was the name. "Lillian Carter," he repeated, as though testing it. "You don't hear that often anymore." She smiled, a little surprised. "I guess not. Names like that," he continued, lifting his glass. "They belong to women who don't stay where they started." It sounded like a compliment. It felt like permission. When she came home that night, Ethan was asleep on the couch. The television cast flickering light across his face, turning him into something almost unfamiliar. His glasses had slipped slightly down his nose, one hand still resting on a stack of papers. Lillian stood there longer than she meant to, watching him. There was a time when she would have woken him gently, coaxed him to bed, maybe laughed about how predictable he was becoming. But something about the room paused, as if stepping into it required her to become someone she no longer fully inhabited. She walked past him quietly. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water, though she wasn't thirsty. Her reflection in the window caught her off guard, makeup still intact, posture still composed. She looked like she belonged somewhere else. Not here. Not entirely. Victor didn't call often. He didn't need to. His messages were brief, almost impersonal. "Dinner. Thursday. You like this place. We're something simple." Lillian told herself it wasn't about him. It was about what surrounded him. The rooms that never felt too small. The conversations that didn't circle around bills or timelines or someday. The absence of waiting. With Ethan, everything had a future tense. With Victor, everything existed now. "You've been out a lot." Ethan's voice came one evening as she slipped off her heels by the door. Not accusatory, just placed carefully into the room. Lillian paused, one shoe in her hand. "Work's been busy." "That's good." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. Another silence followed, long enough to stretch, but not enough to break. Ethan looked like he wanted to say more. He didn't. Instead, he picked up his mug, the same chipped porcelain, and took a sip. The crack had deepened slightly, though neither of them mentioned it. Lillian watched him for a moment. "You could come with me, you know." "To what?" "Things. Events. Dinners." Ethan gave a small, almost amused exhale. "That's not really my world." "It could be." He shook his head gently. "No. It could be yours." The distinction settled between them like dust. Not sharp enough to cut, but impossible to ignore once seen. The last time they had dinner together, it wasn't planned. That was what made it feel almost significant. Lillian had come home early. Ethan had finished work before midnight. Neither of them said it out loud, but there was a quiet awareness, an opening. They sat across from each other at the small table, takeout containers between them. For a while, they talked. About nothing important. A neighbor's dog, a new cafe opening nearby, the weather, of all things. It felt familiar, almost like before. Ethan smiled at something she said, really smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. For a brief moment, Lillian felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or recognition. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down. Victor. Just one word. Tonight. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. Not the message itself, but the way her body responded. The slight straightening of her spine. the subtle withdrawal of attention. "You should go," he said quietly. Lillian looked up. "I didn't say I was going anywhere. You didn't have to." There was no bitterness in his tone. That made it worse. She hesitated. "It's just, I know." He nodded once, as if closing something internally. Lillian set her phone down, screen facing the table. "I can stay." Ethan looked at her then. Really looked. And in that moment, something inside him understood that if she stayed, it wouldn't be because she wanted to. It would be because she felt she should. And that was a different kind of leaving. "You don't have to," he said. The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of permission. She left 20 minutes later. No argument. No slammed doors. Just the quiet sound of heels against the floor. The soft click of the lock. Ethan remained at the table long after the food had gone cold. Across from him, her chair sat slightly pushed back, as if she might return. But it didn't feel temporary. It felt concluded. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. No confrontation. No explanation beyond what was legally required. Irreconcilable differences. Ethan read the phrase several times, as if repetition might reveal something hidden inside it. It didn't. He signed where he was told. On her last day in the apartment, Lillian moved quickly, efficient, focused, detached. Ethan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city he no longer felt part of. "Take care of yourself," she said at one point, not looking at him. "You too." There were 100 things they could have said. Questions. Accusations. Apologies. None of them seemed appropriate anymore. Lillian picked up her last box, then paused. Her eyes drifted to the kitchen counter. The cup. Still there. Still cracked. For a second, something softened in her expression. "You should throw that away," she said. "It's broken." Ethan followed her gaze. "It still holds." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Then she left. That night, Ethan stood alone in the apartment, the silence no longer shared, just empty. He picked up the cup, turning it slowly in his hands. The crack had spread further now, branching like something alive. He brought it to his lips, taking a careful sip. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a drop of coffee slipped through, warm against his fingers. Ethan didn't wipe it away. He just stood there, watching it fall. Not because he didn't notice, but because, somewhere deep down, he had been expecting it. The first cafe Ethan Caldwell opened did not look like success. It looked like restraint. Tucked between a boutique law firm and a vacant retail space in downtown Seattle, it carried no bold signage, no grand opening banners. Just a name etched quietly into glass. Vain. Most people assumed it was a design choice. Minimalist. Abstract. Slightly pretentious. No one asked what it meant. Ethan preferred it that way. The space inside was deliberate in a way that bordered on obsession. Marble counters, pale and cold to the touch. Chairs spaced just far enough apart to prevent intimacy. Lighting calibrated to soften edges but never fully warm them. Every object had a place. Every place had a purpose. Even the cups. Especially the cups. They were custom-made, fine porcelain, hand-finished, each with a single faint line running along the side. Not a crack. Not quite. Just enough to suggest one. Customers noticed it sometimes. "Is this intentional?" one woman asked, turning the cup between her fingers. Ethan, standing behind the counter that day, nodded once. "Yes." She smiled. "It feels fragile." Ethan held her gaze for a moment. "It isn't." He didn't elaborate. The idea had come to him years earlier, though he never spoke about that part. Not the apartment. Not the silence. Not the way something small and ordinary had outlived everything else. He didn't talk about Lillian. Not to investors. Not to staff. Not even to himself in words that could be clearly formed. But she existed in the architecture of everything he built. In the spacing of tables never too close. In the acoustics quiet enough for thoughts to echo. In the coffee itself strong, clean. No unnecessary sweetness. It wasn't nostalgia. It was preservation. Or, maybe, control. Success didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. A feature in a local design magazine. A line out the door on weekday mornings. A mention by someone with influence. Followed by another. Then came the second location. Then the third. Each one identical in philosophy, but refined in execution. Cleaner, sharper, more distant. By the fifth, Ethan no longer worked behind the counter. By the seventh, people stopped associating the brand with a person at all. Vain became a concept, an experience, something curated, elevated, just exclusive enough to feel earned. Investors called it genius. Ethan called it nothing. He rarely spoke about it unless necessary. You've built something rare. The woman sitting across from him in the conference room spoke with measured admiration. She represented a firm looking to expand the brand nationwide. Ethan listened, hands folded neatly in front of him. It's not just coffee, she continued. It's emotional design. People don't just come here to drink. They come to feel something they can't quite name. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to the glass wall behind her. Outside, the city moved in clean lines and muted colors. What do you think they feel? He asked. She smiled, confident. Intimacy, reflection, maybe even comfort. Ethan considered that, then shook his head slightly. No, he said. They feel distance. The woman blinked, caught off guard. Distance? She repeated. Ethan stood, walking slowly toward the window. They feel like they're close to something meaningful, he said quietly, but not quite inside it. He turned back to her. That's why they stay longer than they mean to. By the 10th location, Ethan had stopped visiting regularly. He didn't need to. Everything ran with precision. Systems in place. Managers trained to replicate not just the service, but the atmosphere. The subtle choreography of movement and silence. Still, occasionally, he would appear. Unannounced. Not to inspect, just to observe. The Chicago branch was the one they told him about last. Underperforming, his regional director had said carefully. It's not aligning with the brand the way we expected. Ethan didn't ask for details. Address, he replied. Chicago felt different. Sharper, less forgiving. The wind cut through streets with an impatience Seattle never had. People moved faster, spoke louder, expected more. Ethan arrived early, before the morning rush. From the outside, the cafe looked right. Place, light, clean lines. Inside, something felt off, not visibly, but present, like a note slightly out of tune. He stepped in quietly, unnoticed among the first customers. The barista behind the counter moved with efficiency, but not precision. Cups placed a fraction too hard. Movements just slightly rushed. Ethan watched, listened, waited. Then, a voice. Medium roast, no sugar. It came from behind the counter, directed toward another employee. Calm, controlled, familiar in a way that didn't register immediately, only lingered at the edges of recognition. Ethan's gaze shifted. She stood with her back to him, hair tied loosely, a few strands escaping in a way that suggested time rather than style. Her posture was upright, but not rigid like someone holding themselves together out of habit rather than intention. There was nothing remarkable about her at first glance, nothing that demanded attention. And yet Ethan didn't look away. She turned slightly, reaching for a cup. For a second, her profile caught the light, and something inside him stilled. Not shock, not recognition, fully formed. Just a disruption. Like a memory brushing against the present without permission. He told himself it was coincidence. A resemblance. Time had a way of reshaping faces, softening edges, erasing certainties. It couldn't be order for Daniel. Her voice again, clearer this time. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the table. He looked down at his own hands, as if they might confirm something his mind wasn't ready to. When he looked up again, she was already moving, serving, passing cups across the counter with practiced ease. Detached, professional, unfamiliar. He stayed longer than he intended, not watching her directly, just aware. Every movement registered somewhere beneath conscious thought. The way she held the cup not by the handle, but near the rim. The slight pause before placing it down. The absence of unnecessary words. It wasn't memory, it was echo. When he finally stood to leave, something unexpected happened. She looked at him. Not long, not intensely, just a brief glance, the kind given to any customer passing through. Their eyes met. For less than a second, no recognition, no flicker, nothing. She moved on. Outside, the wind hit him harder than before. Ethan paused on the sidewalk, breath catching slightly not from the cold, from something else. Something quieter, more precise. He turned back toward the glass window. Inside, she was already gone from view, absorbed into the rhythm of the place, as if she had never existed beyond that moment. Ethan stood there, unmoving. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled. Not in relief, not in disappointment, but in realization. Years of building something controlled, something intentional, something untouched by the past, and yet it had found him anyway. Not loudly, not dramatically, just standing behind a counter, holding a cup, unaware, unchanged, or maybe changed in ways he had yet to understand. That night, Ethan didn't review reports. He didn't call his director. He didn't make decisions. He sat alone in his hotel room, a porcelain cup resting on the table in front of him. Same design, same faint line running along its side. He traced it with his finger, slowly. This one didn't leak. Not yet. But the line was there, waiting. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Lillian?" The name didn't echo. It just settled into the room, unanswered. Ethan returned the next morning. Not early enough to seem deliberate. Not late enough to be accidental. The city had already found its rhythm. Cars threading through intersections, people moving with purpose. The air still carrying a trace of last night's cold. He walked the same block twice before entering, as if calibrating himself to something he could not yet define. Inside, the cafe breathed in its usual, measured quiet. Everything was in place. Everything was controlled, except him. He chose a table near the window this time. Not too close to the counter, but not hidden either. A position that allowed observation, without intention, visibility, without declaration. Ethan sat down, removed his coat, and placed it carefully over the back of the chair. His movements were slower than usual, deliberate in a way that bordered on hesitation. He told himself he was here to understand what had gone wrong with the location. That was the reason. That had to be the reason. She was already there, not behind the counter this time, but moving between tables, taking orders, clearing cups, existing within the space without drawing attention to herself. Lillian. The name felt unfamiliar in his mind now, like a word from a language he once spoke fluently but had not used in years. He watched her without turning his head. There were differences. Of course, there were. Time had softened the sharp precision she used to carry like a second skin. Her movements were efficient, but no longer intentional in the way he remembered. There was no performance in them anymore. No subtle awareness of being seen. She did not occupy space. She passed through it. And yet, there were things that hadn't changed. The way her fingers hovered for half a second before setting a cup down, as if measuring distance by instinct. The slight tilt of her head when listening, even when she already knew what would be said. Small things. Unimportant to anyone else. Unavoidable to him. "Sir?" Her voice, closer now. Ethan looked up. She stood beside his table, a small notepad in her hand, pen poised but not yet moving. Up close, the changes were clearer. The faint lines near her eyes not deep but present. The kind that came not from laughter, but from holding expressions too long. Her makeup was minimal, functional. Her gaze rested on him, steady and professional, waiting. No flicker, no hesitation, no recognition. Ethan held her eyes for a fraction longer than necessary. Long enough for something inside him to search for a trace, a fracture, a misalignment in her composure that might suggest memory. There was none. "What can I get for you?" she asked. Simple, neutral, unloaded. Ethan's throat tightened slightly, though his expression remained unchanged. "Black coffee," he said. She nodded, writing it down without looking away. "Medium or dark roast?" He almost smiled. It was the same question, the same tone, but stripped of everything that once gave it meaning. Medium. A brief pause. Anything else? There was a moment small, almost invisible, where Ethan considered saying something else. Something unnecessary. Something personal. Instead, he shook his head. "That's all." She gave a polite nod. "I'll be right back." And just like that, she turned, walked away, carrying nothing of him with her. Ethan sat there, his hands resting flat against the table. The surface was smooth, cold, familiar. He had designed it this way. Every detail, every distance, every silence. But sitting there now, none of it felt like his. It felt like something he had built for someone else. Someone who no longer existed. At the counter, Lillian moved with the same quiet efficiency. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. The barista handed her the cup, and she adjusted it slightly on the saucer, a subtle correction, almost instinctive. Ethan watched the motion. There it was, that pause, that half-second of alignment, unchanged, unconscious, unclaimed. When she returned, she didn't look at him immediately. She placed the cup down first. Carefully, not in front of him, but slightly to the right, exactly where she used to place it years ago, when she knew he preferred reaching with his dominant hand. Ethan's breath caught, not visibly, but enough. Only then did she meet his eyes. "Let me know if you need anything else." Her voice was softer this time, or maybe he was listening differently. He glanced down at the cup. Porcelain. White. A single faint line running along the side. For a moment, the room seemed to narrow, sound pulling back, light flattening, everything reducing to the space between his hand and the cup. He reached for it slowly. His fingers brushed the surface. Warm. Intact. He lifted it. Took a sip. The taste was correct. Precisely calibrated. Exactly as it should be. And yet, it meant nothing. "You're not from here." Her voice again. Ethan looked up, slightly surprised. She hadn't moved away completely. She stood a step back, not intruding, but not entirely gone either. It wasn't curiosity in her tone. It was observation. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "What makes you say that?" She shrugged lightly. "People from here don't usually look around like that." "Like what?" "Like they're trying to remember something." The words landed quietly. Too quietly. Ethan studied her face. Still nothing. No recognition. Only a kind of distant awareness. The same she might offer any stranger who lingered too long and thought. He let out a small breath. "Maybe I am." She nodded, as if that confirmed something unimportant. "Chicago's not great for that," she said. "Remembering." A pause. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "People come here to forget." Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "And you?" he asked. The question slipped out before he could stop it. Not aggressive, not probing, just there. Lillian held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then she looked away. "I just work here." The answer was clean, final, unopenable. She left again. This time without lingering, without looking back. Ethan remained seated, the cup still in his hand. Her words echoed, not in sound, but in absence. "I just work here." Not, "I used to." Not, "I was." Not, "I remember." Just existence reduced to function. He glanced down at the porcelain. The faint line along its side caught the light. For years, it had meant something to him. A fracture that didn't break. A past that could be contained. But sitting here, across from a woman who had once known him in ways no one else ever had, and now didn't know him at all, the meaning shifted. It wasn't about survival. It was about erasure. Ethan finished the coffee slowly. Not because he wanted to, but because leaving too soon felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to name. When he finally stood, he placed cash on the table. More than necessary. He hesitated for a moment. Then, deliberately, he left the cup slightly off-center. A small misalignment. A break in pattern. Something noticeable. Something intentional. At the counter, Lillian glanced over as he walked toward the door. Her eyes lingered on him for half a second longer than before. Not recognition, just pause. Then her gaze dropped to the table he had left behind. She noticed the cup, out of place. Her brow furrowed slightly. For a moment, she didn't move, as if something about it unsettled her. Not logically, not clearly, but enough to interrupt the rhythm she had been moving within. Then someone called her name. Not Lillian. Lily. She turned, answered, continued. Outside, the wind had softened. Ethan stood still for a moment, his reflection faint in the glass. Inside, she moved again, absorbed, distant, unreachable. He could walk back in, say her name, break the silence, undo the distance. Or at least try. Instead, he turned away. Not out of fear, not yet. But because something deeper had begun to form. Something quieter than anger, more complicated than longing. A question, not about who she was now, but about who he had been, to someone who could forget him so completely. Behind the glass, Lillian adjusted the cup on the table, centered it, perfectly, as if it had never been disturbed. Ethan did not intend to return. That was what he told himself the first night, standing in the hotel room with the city humming beyond the glass. He had seen enough, understood enough. The rest, whatever remained, belonged to a version of himself he had already outgrown. That was the narrative. It sounded reasonable, complete, and yet. The next morning, he found himself walking the same block again. The cafe door opened with the same quiet resistance, the same controlled release of sound. Inside, nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Or maybe it was just him. Ethan chose a different seat this time, farther back. A corner, partially obscured by a structural column designed, ironically, to create privacy without isolation. He had approved that detail himself. Now it became a shield. From here, he could see her without being seen too easily. Or at least, that was the illusion. Lillian moved through the space like someone who had learned not to leave an imprint. There was no wasted motion, no lingering presence. She existed in sequences. Approach, serve, withdraw. A pattern. Predictable. Safe. Ethan watched the rhythm form. Repeat. Dissolve. At first, he looked for signs of struggle, fatigue, frustration. Something that might suggest the weight of her circumstances. There were traces. A slight stiffness in her shoulders near the end of her shift. The way her fingers flexed subtly between orders, as if easing tension she no longer acknowledged consciously. But it wasn't what unsettled him. It was the absence of something else. There was no visible regret, no longing, no fracture, just stillness. Not peace. Something closer to vacancy. You come here often. The question came from the man sitting at the next table, delivered casually, without expectation. Ethan glanced over. Mid-30s. Laptop open. Half-finished espresso. Recently, Ethan replied. The man nodded, as if that explained something. They've got a good system, he said. Staff doesn't talk much. I like that. Ethan followed his gaze briefly to the counter, to the measured quiet. Yes, he said. It's intentional. The man smirked faintly. Feels a little cold, though. Ethan didn't respond, because he didn't disagree. By the third visit, she had stopped noticing him entirely. Not consciously. There had been a moment, early on, where her eyes paused a fraction longer when scanning the room. Not recognition, just the brain registering repetition. A familiar stranger. But even that faded. He became part of the background. A fixed object in a controlled environment. Ethan realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was how she experienced most people now. Not as individuals, but as functions, orders, payments, movements. No one stayed long enough to require memory. No one mattered enough to disrupt it. On his fourth visit, it rained. Not heavily, just enough to blur the edges of the city, to soften outlines into something indistinct. Inside, the cafe felt even more contained. Sound absorbed, light diffused. Ethan watched as Lillian stood by the counter, waiting between orders. For the first time, she wasn't moving. She wasn't doing anything, just standing. Her gaze rested somewhere unfixed, not on a person, not on a task, just forward. It wasn't emptiness, it was something more deliberate, like a door closed from the inside. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, because he recognized it. Not in her, in himself, years ago, after she left. That same stillness. That same refusal to engage with anything that might reopen what had already been sealed. He hadn't seen it then, or maybe he had, and chosen to name it differently. Strength, focus, reinvention. But sitting here now, watching her carry it with such quiet precision, he wondered if it had always been something else. Excuse me, her voice again, not to him, to someone behind him. But it shifted something anyway. Ethan didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could map her movements now without looking. The distance between tables. The timing between steps. The exact moment she would reach the counter. Adjust a cup. Pause. That pause. Always there. Always the same. Unclaimed. He started noticing other things too. Details he hadn't seen at first. The way other staff spoke to her. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just neutrally, as if she had established boundaries that didn't invite closeness. They called her Lily. Always Lily. Shortened. Simplified. Easier. Ethan heard it repeatedly. Lily. Table 3. Lily. Can you restock? Lily. Break in 10. Each time, the name landed with a kind of quiet distortion. Because to him, she had never been Lily. She had been. He stopped the thought before it completed. On his 6th visit, he noticed the ring. Not on her finger. In her pocket. She took it out absent-mindedly while waiting for an order to process, rolling it between her fingers once, twice, then slipping it back inside. Quick. Unconscious. Almost hidden. Ethan's breath slowed. He couldn't see it clearly from where he sat. But he didn't need to. He knew the shape, the weight, the history embedded in something so small. He had chosen it once, or thought he had. Now, it existed like everything else between them, detached from meaning, retained without acknowledgement. You're waiting for someone, the same man from before, or someone similar. It was hard to tell. Ethan didn't look up this time. No. The man followed his line of sight, subtle but not invisible. Oh, he said. Got it. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't correct him, because explaining would require language he no longer trusted. By the 7th visit, Ethan stopped pretending it was about the cafe, stopped framing it as observation, analysis. There was no report forming in his mind. No solution, only repetition. A loop he stepped into willingly, watching her exist without him, without the past, without anything that required explanation. And the more he watched, the less he understood what he had been holding on to all these years. That afternoon, something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. She approached his table without hesitation. No notepad this time. No question, just presence. Ethan looked up. Their eyes met, for a second longer than usual. Not recognition, but not entirely neutral either. Something searching, faint, unstable. You've been coming here a lot, she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact, spoken aloud. Ethan held her gaze. Yes. A pause. Then, do you like it here? The question lingered, simple on the surface, but something in her tone suggested it wasn't about the coffee. Ethan considered the room, the design, the distance, her. I don't know, he said. Lillian studied him for a moment, as if weighing something she couldn't quite define. Then she nodded, slowly. Most people don't, she said. They just think they do. Another pause. Quieter this time. Then she stepped back. I'll bring your usual. Usual. The word landed differently. Not as recognition. Not as connection. Just pattern. He had become one. When she returned with the coffee, she placed it down with that same precise pause. Same angle. Same distance. Unchanged. Ethan watched her hand linger for a fraction longer than necessary, as if something inside her hesitated, not in memory, but in instinct. Then, it was gone. She turned, walked away. Ethan stared at the cup. The faint line along its side caught the light again. Unbroken. Contained. Predictable. For years, he had believed he was preserving something, holding on to a truth that still mattered. But, sitting here now, watching a woman who carried no visible trace of what they had been, he began to understand something he hadn't allowed himself to before. She hadn't just left him. She had left that version of herself entirely. And in doing so, she had taken something with her that he had been trying to keep alive, alone. Ethan lifted the cup, took a sip. It tasted the same as always. Perfect. Controlled. Empty. Across the room, Lillian moved on to the next table. Another order. Another interaction. Another moment that would not be remembered. And for the first time since he had seen her again, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not anger. Not longing. Something quieter. More dangerous. The beginning of a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. If she could forget so completely, what exactly had he been holding on to all this time? Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, nothing had changed. Except perhaps the meaning of everything. It happened on a morning that felt indistinguishable from the others. No storm, no disruption, no sign that anything at all was about to reach its quiet breaking point. The cafe opened at 7. By 7:15, the first wave had passed commuters, briefcases, headphones, conversations clipped short by time. By 7:30, the space settled into its familiar rhythm, restrained, deliberate, controlled. Ethan was already seated. The same table, the same angle, the same distance between him and the counter that allowed observation without intrusion. Except today he wasn't observing. He was waiting. He didn't know for what, only that something inside him had stopped looping, stopped analyzing, stopped justifying. It had gone still. Like the moment before something finally decides what it is. Lillian moved differently that morning. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Ethan did. There was a subtle misalignment in her rhythm. Her steps, a fraction slower. Her pauses slightly longer. As if something beneath the surface had shifted just enough to disturb the pattern. Not emotion. Not memory. Something closer to fatigue or awareness. She glanced toward his table once. Briefly. Then again, the second time lingered. Not recognition, but interruption. Like a thought that almost forms before dissolving. He didn't look away. For the first time since returning, Ethan allowed his gaze to rest on her without pretense. Not hidden, not shielded. Just there. Present. Unprotected. When their eyes met, she didn't immediately turn away. That was new. A second passed. Then another. Something in her expression tightened, not visibly, but internally, like a muscle reacting before the mind could name why. She walked toward him. No notepad, no practiced opening, just her presence, arriving at his table without ceremony. Ethan felt his pulse slow, not quicken, as if his body had already accepted something his mind was still circling. "You're early," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, not softer, just closer. Ethan nodded once. "So are you." A faint shift in her expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Not empty. But dense. Filled with everything neither of them was willing or able to say. She glanced at the table. Then back at him. Same? The word was simple, but it carried weight. Routine. Repetition. A pattern that existed without meaning, and yet somehow felt personal. Ethan held her gaze. For a moment, just a moment, the answer almost changed, almost became something else. A name, a memory, a fracture in the carefully constructed distance between them. Instead, he nodded. Yes. She didn't write it down. Didn't need to. At the counter, her movements slowed. Not dramatically, just enough. The barista beside her spoke something about inventory, about a missing shipment, but her responses were delayed, slightly offbeat. Her attention wasn't fully there. It drifted, back, toward the table, toward him. She picked up the cup, porcelain, white. The faint line running along its side caught the light. For a second, her fingers paused over it, rested, as if something about the texture, something about the familiarity of it resisted being placed into its usual role. Then she exhaled, almost imperceptibly, and continued. Ethan watched her return, every step measured, every inch of distance closing with a quiet inevitability. This was it, not a confrontation, not a revelation, but something more precise, more final. She placed the cup down, not immediately. Her hand hovered for that half-second longer, this time, just above the surface of the table, as if the space between her and the object carried more weight than usual. Then contact, porcelain meeting wood, a soft, controlled sound. Ethan's eyes dropped to the cup, then to her hand, still there, resting lightly against the rim. For a fraction too long, he didn't move, didn't reach for it, didn't break the moment. Lillian's gaze remained on the cup, not on him. Something in her expression shifted, subtle, unstable, like a reflection disturbed by the smallest ripple. Her fingers tightened slightly, then loosened. She looked up. Their eyes met again, and this time there was something. Not recognition, not memory, but resistance. Like a door that had been closed for so long, it no longer opened easily, even when something on the other side knocked. "You." She started. The word slipped out before she could stop it. Then paused. Suspended. Ethan felt it. Felt the moment stretch thin. Fragile. On the edge of becoming something irreversible. He could say her name. End it. Collapse the distance. Rewrite the silence. Instead, he waited. Lillian blinked once. Whatever had surfaced retreated just as quickly. Her expression reset. Not consciously, but completely. Need anything else? She finished. The sentence closed. Clean. Professional. Safe. Ethan's chest tightened, not from disappointment, from clarity. This was the moment. Not when she recognized him, but when she almost did and chose, instinctively, not to follow it. Not because she knew, but because something in her had learned not to look back. "No," he said quietly. His voice was steady. More than he expected. "I'm fine." The words settled between them. Simple. Final. Lillian nodded, but didn't move. Not immediately. Her gaze lingered just long enough to suggest that something unresolved still hovered beneath the surface. Then, slowly she stepped back. The distance returned. Reassembled. Ethan reached for the cup. His fingers brushed the same place hers had been. Still warm. Still real. He lifted it. Paused. For a second, the world narrowed again to the rim of the cup, to the space between past and present, to the version of himself that had once believed this moment would mean something else. Then he drank. The taste was perfect, exactly as designed, balanced, controlled, empty. Across the room, Lillian moved again. Serving, responding, existing. But something in her rhythm remained slightly off. A fraction delayed, a fraction uncertain. As if her body remembered something her mind refused to hold. She glanced toward him once more. Quick, uncertain. Then looked away. Ethan finished the coffee slowly. Not dragging the moment. Not resisting it. Just allowing it to be what it was. When the cup was empty, he set it down carefully. Centered. Aligned. As if restoring order mattered. As if the illusion of control still held meaning. He stood. Reached into his pocket. Placed cash on the table. More than necessary. Not out of generosity. Out of habit. Then he paused. Just for a second. His hand resting lightly against the edge of the table. He could still say it. Her name. His name. Anything. Break the silence. But the silence had already said everything. Ethan turned. Walked toward the door. Each step measured. Unhurried. Unstopped. Behind him, the cafe continued. Unchanged. At the counter, Lillian's hand stilled mid-motion. No reason. No trigger. Just pause. She looked up. Toward the door. Toward his back as it disappeared into the morning light. Something tightened in her chest. Faint. Unplaceable. Like the echo of a thought she had forgotten before finishing. Her eyes shifted to the table he had left behind. The cup. Empty. Perfectly centered. Her brow furrowed slightly. Then almost unconsciously she walked over. Picked it up. Her fingers traced the faint line along its side. The same place. The same motion. Her breath caught just slightly. A flicker. A sensation without language. Without memory. Without form. Then she exhaled. Set the cup down. Turned away. Outside the air felt different. Not lighter. Not heavier. Just clear. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk, the door closing softly behind him. No resolution. No confrontation. No recognition. And yet something inside him had shifted. Not healed. Not erased. But released. The need to be seen. To be remembered. To be acknowledged by someone who had already let go. It loosened. Quietly. Completely. Inside, Lillian returned to her routine. Orders. Movement. Silence. But once, just once, she hesitated. Her hand hovering above another cup. That same half-second pause. Only this time it lingered longer. As if something, somewhere deep within her, had almost remembered. The call came before noon. Ethan didn't answer it at first. He stood by the window of his hotel room, looking out over a city that moved without him. Cars threading through intersections. People crossing streets with purpose. Unaware of the quiet recalibration that had taken place inside someone watching from above. His phone buzzed again. Persistent. Measured. Predictable. Just like everything he had built. He picked it up on the third ring. Yes. Mr. Caldwell. His regional director's voice came through, precise and slightly cautious. We've been waiting on your evaluation of the Chicago location. A pause. Ethan let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, but because he needed it. It's functioning, he said finally. A faint exhale on the other end. Not relief, just acknowledgement. Functioning, she repeated. Do you recommend restructuring? Ethan's gaze drifted to his reflection in the glass. Clean lines, controlled expression, nothing out of place. For a moment, he saw himself the way others did. Composed, successful, untouchable. Then, beneath that something else. Not yet, he said. Another pause. We've also had a few internal notes about staff performance, she added carefully. There's one employee in particular. Lily Carter. Consistent, but Ethan's grip on the phone tightened slightly. But, he prompted, she doesn't engage much. Customers don't complain, but there's no connection. Some of the managers think it affects the atmosphere. Connection. The word lingered. Ethan let out a quiet breath. She's doing her job, he said. Yes, but that's enough. The interruption was soft, final. On the other end, a brief hesitation. Understood, she replied. The call ended shortly after. No further questions. No need. Ethan set the phone down slowly. The room felt different now. Not because anything had changed, but because something had been named. Out loud. Lily Carter. Reduced. Reframed. Contained within a system he had created. And protected. He had never intended for it to feel like this. When he started Vane, it wasn't about power, not consciously. It was about structure. About creating something that couldn't unravel the way his life had. Something precise, controlled, predictable. But somewhere along the way control had become indistinguishable from distance. And distance had become the brand itself. That afternoon, Ethan returned. Not as a visitor, not as an observer, but as something else entirely. He didn't announce himself, didn't inform the manager, didn't step behind the counter or alter the rhythm of the space. He entered the same way he always had, quietly, unremarkably, invisible in plain sight. Lillian was there. Of course she was, moving through the same patterns, serving the same drinks, existing within the same carefully constructed distance. Nothing about her had changed since that morning. And yet everything had, because now, Ethan saw it differently. Not just her, himself. He took his usual seat, but the space no longer felt observational, it felt implicated. Every detail around him, every angle, every pause, every measured silence, was something he had chosen, something he had designed, not just for customers, but for her, without knowing, without intending. And yet there she was, perfectly aligned with it. As if the system had been built to contain exactly what she had become. You're back. Her voice, calm, unremarkable. Ethan looked up. She stood beside the table. The same neutral posture, the same unreadable expression. But now, knowing what he knew, it felt different. Not distant, not detached, but mirrored. Yes, he said. A brief pause. Then, she nodded. Same? The word again. Familiar, patterned, safe. Ethan held her gaze, for a second longer than before. Then, yes. She turned, walked away. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes following her movement, not with longing, not with restraint, but with something closer to understanding. This wasn't just her detachment, it was learned, refined, chosen. The same way his had been. A memory surfaced, uninvited, uncomfortable. Lillian standing in the doorway years ago, arms folded. Waiting, not for answers, for presence. Are you listening? He had said yes. He had always said yes. But he hadn't looked up, hadn't seen, hadn't stepped into the space she was offering. Not fully, not enough. At the time, he told himself it was temporary. That once things stabilized, once the projects landed, once the pressure eased, he would return. Be present, be there. But presence, he realized now, wasn't something you postponed. It was something you practiced, or lost. Lillian returned with the coffee. Same movement, same pause, same precision. She placed the cup down. This time, Ethan noticed something new. Not in her. In the space between them. There was no tension anymore. No pull. No unfinished thread stretching across years. Just two people occupying the same moment without needing to define it. Careful, she said quietly, almost as an afterthought. It's hot. Ethan looked at the cup, then back at her. I know. The words carried more than the moment required. She didn't react, or maybe she chose not to. A small nod. Then she stepped away. Ethan picked up the cup, held it, didn't drink. Instead, he studied the faint line along its side. For years, he had believed it represented something unresolved. Something broken, but contained. But now it looked different. Not like a crack. Like a boundary. A deliberate separation between what was held and what was allowed to escape. Across the room, Lillian laughed softly at something a coworker said. The sound was brief, unexpected. It caught Ethan off guard. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was. There was no weight in it, no history, no trace of what they had been, just a moment. Self-contained, free. Ethan felt something shift again. Not sharp, not painful, just precise. A realization settling into place. Lillian hadn't just left him for someone else. She had left a version of herself that no longer fit within the life they had built. And he hadn't followed, hadn't adapted, hadn't seen the distance growing until it had already solidified. Victor had been an exit, not the cause. Ethan took a sip of the coffee. It tasted the same. Perfect, controlled, empty. But now he understood why. Because it had been designed that way. By him. Near the counter, the manager approached Lillian, saying something low. She nodded, listening. Composed, present, functional. Ethan watched for a moment longer. Then looked away. Not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to analyze. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, he didn't feel the need to stay. He finished the coffee, set the cup down. Not centered this time. Not aligned. Just placed. Uncorrected. When he stood, Lillian didn't look over immediately. She was busy, occupied, engaged in the rhythm of the place. Only as he reached the door did her gaze lift. Their eyes met, briefly, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledgement. The kind you give a stranger you've seen more than once. Nothing more, nothing less. Ethan nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. Then he left. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Unaffected, unchanged. Ethan stepped into it without hesitation. For years, he had built something to contain what he couldn't resolve. A system, a structure, a world where nothing spilled unless he allowed it. And in doing so, he had created the exact distance that once drove her away. Back inside, Lillian returned to the table, picked up the cup. Her fingers paused briefly on the faint line. Not long, not enough. Then she carried it away. That night, Ethan made a decision. Not about the cafe, not about the business, but about something far less tangible. He would not reveal himself. Not now. Not later. Not ever. Not because he feared what it might change, but because he finally understood that some truths, once spoken, don't restore anything. They only reopen what both people have already survived. And survival, he realized, was not the same as returning. Ethan left Chicago before the city could begin to recognize him. No farewell, no final visit, no moment of standing outside the cafe for longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to call him back. He checked out of the hotel before sunrise, the sky still suspended in that gray hesitation he had once associated with another city, another life. Seattle. It felt distant now, not geographically, but emotionally, like something preserved behind glass, visible but unreachable. At the airport, everything moved with quiet efficiency. Passengers lining up, announcements dissolving into background noise, the low hum of departure of people leaving without explanation, without ceremony. Ethan sat by the window, hands resting loosely on his lap. Still, not tense, not expectant. Just present. For the first time in years, there was no narrative forming in his mind. No imagined confrontation. No alternate version of events where things had unfolded differently. Just the simple recognition that nothing needed to be resolved. Because nothing could be returned to what it had been. He thought of the cup. Not the one in Chicago. The original. Chipped porcelain. Uneven. Flawed in a way that once felt human. He hadn't brought it with him. Hadn't even thought about it when he packed. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped being an object he needed to carry. Not because it meant less, but because it had already done what it was meant to do. Back in Seattle, the rain welcomed him without urgency. The city hadn't changed. Or maybe it had, in ways he no longer tracked. His apartment was different now, larger, quieter, curated with the same precision as the cafes he owned. Clean lines, controlled light, nothing unnecessary. He stood in the kitchen for a long time before moving. Then, almost without thinking, he opened a cabinet. Inside rows of identical porcelain cups, white, smooth, each with that same faint line running along the side. Perfectly manufactured imperfection. He reached for one, held it, turned it slightly, watching the line catch the dim afternoon light. For years, he had believed he was honoring something, preserving the moment. But standing there now, it felt less like memory and more like replication. A pattern repeated until it lost its origin.
He placed the cup back. Didn't make coffee. Didn't need to.
Across the country, in a city that did not wait for reflection, Lillian finished her shift like any other, clocking out with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. No lingering conversations, no plans for the evening, just movement, forward. The air outside had cooled, the kind of cold that sharpened edges, made everything feel more immediate, more real. She pulled her coat tighter as she walked, her heels softer against the pavement, now less deliberate, more worn. The city moved around her, unaware, uninterested. She passed storefronts without looking in, crossed streets without hesitation, routine, predictable, contained. But something small, persistent remained. Not a memory, not clearly, just an interruption. A slight delay in thought. A hesitation where there hadn't been one before. It had started that morning. Or maybe earlier. She couldn't place it. At a red light, she paused. Not because she had to. Because her body did. Her fingers slipped into her coat pocket. Found something familiar. Metal. Cool. She pulled it out. The ring. Simple. Unremarkable to anyone else. She turned it slowly between her fingers, watching the way it caught the streetlight. For a moment, just a moment, her breath caught. A sensation rose. Faint. Unformed. Like the edge of a dream that disappears when you try to focus on it. A table. A cup. A hand placing it down. Not recently, but not entirely gone either. And a feeling. Not love. Not loss. Something quieter. Recognition without context. A car honked behind her. The light had changed. Lillian blinked, the moment dissolving instantly. She slipped the ring back into her pocket, crossed the street, continued walking. That night she sat alone in her small apartment. The space was functional, minimal, nothing that invited reflection. She turned on the light, then off again, then sat in the dimness, letting the city's glow filter in through the window. Her thoughts didn't settle. They didn't form into anything she could name. Just fragments, unconnected, unresolved. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't immediately fall into that familiar stillness. Instead, there was movement. Not in the room. Inside. Something shifting. Quiet. Insistent. A voice. Not heard. Felt. "You're not from here." She opened her eyes. The room was empty. The silence, intact. But her chest tightened slightly, as if something had brushed against a part of her she had forgotten existed. Across the country, Ethan stood by his window. The city stretched out before him, familiar in a way that no longer required attachment. He held nothing in his hands. No cup. No object. No symbol. For the first time, there was no need for one. He thought of her. Not as she had been. Not as she was now. But as something in between. A space where memory and absence overlapped. And he realized that was where she would remain. Not in his life. Not in his future. But in that quiet, undefined place where things are no longer lived, but not entirely gone. Ethan closed his eyes. Not to remember. Not to forget. Just to be. In Chicago, Lillian stood by her window, looking out at a city that reflected nothing back. Her hand moved unconsciously to her pocket again. Rested there. Still. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them returned. Neither of them understood fully what had been lost or what had been preserved. But somewhere in the space between what was and what could never be again, something remained. Not love. Not regret. Not even memory. just the faint outline of two people who had once recognized each other completely and now only felt the absence of that recognition, like a shape they could no longer see but still somehow carried.
And in that silence, for the first time, neither of them tried to fill it.